Hello, dear Sleepyheads. Tonight we travel to the mist-covered mountains of Wallachia, to an age when the ancient world was fading into the medieval, and to the story of a prince whose name would echo through history as both a defender and a terror. This is the tale of Vlad III, called Dracula, whose life was marked by betrayal, endless war, and an unyielding pursuit of justice that turned him into legend. But before we step into this darker path, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. If these midnight wanderings through history bring you calm, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps me bring more stories from the shadows of time. Now close your eyes and let us quietly walk into the world of 15th century Wallachia to meet the prince who would become known as the Impaler. In the year 1431, within the fortress town of Sigishora, nestled in the rolling hills of Transylvania, a child was born who would grow to embody both the hopes and the terrors of his age, Vlad III. Dracula came into the world during one of the most turbulent times in Eastern European history, when the powers of Christianity and Islam clashed constantly across the borderlands, and when the survival of a small principality depended on the sharp, cunning and ruthless will of its rulers. Sigishora then was a thriving Saxon merchant town. Its cobblestone streets rang with the sounds of trade and skilled craftsmanship. The fortress on the hill provided safety for the merchants who carried goods between the Hungarian kingdom and the Byzantine lands to the south. It was there that Vlad's father, Vlad III Dracula, established his residence while seeking allies for his claim to the throne of Wallachia. The name Dracula meant dragon in Romanian, but it carried deeper weight. Vlad II had been admitted into the Order of the Dragon, a knightly brotherhood created by the Holy Roman Emperor to protect Christian Europe against the advancing Ottoman Empire. To bear the dragon was both an honor and a burden, a sacred vow to resist the infidel and defend the faith. This legacy would hang heavy on young Vlad's life. Wallachia itself was a prize worth fighting over. Though small, it controlled fertile plains between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River, making it rich in agriculture and crucial in strategy. Its location made it the natural buffer between the Ottomans pushing north and the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland. Whoever held Wallachia held the trade routes and the military gates to Central Europe. Vlad's childhood unfolded in an atmosphere of political uncertainty that taught him early the meaning of survival and power. The throne of Wallachia shifted hands often as rival claimants fought with the backing of foreign powers. His father's rule was threatened constantly by Hungarian support, Ottoman pressure, and local boyars eager to seize advantage in chaos. Like most nobles of his age, Vlad's education began early. He learned to read and write in Romanian and in Church Slavonic, the liturgical tongue of the Orthodox Church. Latin, the language of diplomacy and learning, was added as he grew older. But far more critical for his destiny was his training in the arts of war and statecraft, taught by men hardened in Europe's most treacherous political battlefield. The castle of his youth was alive with unease and preparation. Messengers rode in with urgent news at every hour. Generals debated strategies in the Great Hall, while servants readied arms and supplies for campaigns that could begin at a moment's notice. The young Vlad watched with sharp eyes, absorbing lessons that would make him one of the most feared rulers of his century. His father's court reflected Wallachia's position at the crossroads of civilizations. Orthodox priests conducted ceremonies in Byzantine tradition, their chants tracing back to Constantinople. Hungarian nobles arrived with customs and gossip from the royal court at Buda. Merchants from Italian city-states shared whispers of Renaissance inventions and intrigues. Even Ottoman emissaries came at times, stark reminders of the growing Turkish shadow to the south. The most scarring moment of Vlad's youth came in 1442, when he was about 11. To secure Ottoman support for his reign, his father agreed to send two of his youngest sons, Vlad and his brother Radu, to the Sultan's court as hostages. This was a common tool of medieval diplomacy designed to guarantee a ruler's loyalty. But for the children taken, it meant years torn from family and homeland. Their journey to the Ottoman capital stretched for weeks, carrying them from familiar forests and farmlands into strange lands of different sights, voices, and faiths. As they neared the magnificent city of Adrianople, home of the Sultan's court, the young Vlad must have felt the full weight of his uncertain fate settle upon his shoulders. The Ottoman court was unlike anything the Wallachian princes had ever known. The palace was its own world, filled with gardens, libraries, mosques, and sprawling administrative halls that managed the machinery of an immense empire. The Sultan's household included thousands of officials, guards, servants, and slaves drawn from every corner of the known world. The wealth and refinement on display far surpassed anything found in the smaller and humbler courts of Eastern Europe. Vlad and Radu were housed in quarters suitable for princes, but they remained prisoners whose survival depended entirely on their father's loyalty to the Sultan. Their education was both privilege and indoctrination, as they were taught Turkish customs, language, and Islamic theology, while being introduced to the methods of Ottoman governance. The purpose was clear: to reshape them into loyal allies who could one day rule their homeland as obedient vassals of the empire. The Ottoman system of education was remarkably advanced, designed to uncover and sharpen talent regardless of one's background. Vlad studied mathematics, literature, military science, and the art of statecraft alongside other hostage princes and the brightest recruits destined for the Janissary Corps. His instructors admired his quick intelligence and extraordinary memory, but they also noted a stubborn defiance that resisted full assimilation. Military training formed the core of his years in captivity. Vlad learned Turkish methods of swordplay, spear combat, and archery, techniques that had repeatedly crushed European armies. He studied the strategies that had delivered Ottoman victories at Kosovo, Varna, and countless battlefields. Most importantly, he was taught to think like an Ottoman commander, analyzing both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the empire's war machine. Yet life in the Sultan's court also carried humiliation and psychological torment. Vlad was constantly reminded that he was a hostage, his fate tied to his father's uncertain loyalty. At times, officials threatened him with punishment whenever Wallachian actions displeased the Sultan. This unending insecurity carved deep scars into his mind, instilling a fortress mentality that would shape his harsh style of rule. Over the years, Vlad and Radu took different paths under captivity. Radu, naturally diplomatic and adaptable, embraced Turkish culture, even converting to Islam. His compliance earned him favor at court and the promise of Ottoman support for future ambitions. Vlad, however, clung fiercely to his Orthodox faith and his Wallachian identity, careful to conceal his resistance but never surrendering it outright. News from home reached them regularly, often grim. Their father's reign was unstable, shaken by rebellions and invasions. Hungarian forces under the renowned General John Hunyadi launched repeated campaigns into Ottoman territory, sometimes with Wallachian involvement. Each conflict brought fresh scrutiny upon the two princes, who lived under the constant suspicion of their captors. Then, in 1447, tragedy struck. Vlad III Dracula was killed during a rebellion by Wallachian boyars aided by Hungary, his body buried without ceremony at a monastery near Târgoviște. The news reached the Ottoman courts swiftly, carried through a web of spies and messengers that reported every detail of the chaos consuming Wallachia. For the first time, the young hostages faced the possibility of never seeing their homeland again. Yet the Ottoman response revealed the cold pragmatism of empire. Instead of discarding the orphaned princes, the Sultan's advisors saw opportunity. A loyal puppet in Wallachia could extend Ottoman influence across the borderlands. Despite his resistance to full assimilation, Vlad was viewed as a potentially valuable instrument. Plans were laid for a military campaign to install him on his father IS throne under Turkish protection. In 1448, Vlad marched back into Wallachia at the head of an Ottoman force. Though small, the army was experienced, and it offered him his first exposure to the realities of command. The march across Bulgarian lands under Ottoman control revealed to him the empire's administrative order and cultural diversity, further broadening his understanding of power. Returning to Wallachia after 6 years in captivity must have been overwhelming for the 17-year-old prince. The familiar landscapes of his childhood had hardly changed, but he himself had been transformed. He now spoke Turkish as fluently as his native tongue, grasped Ottoman methods of governance, and carried the instincts of survival honed in one of the most dangerous courts on earth. Yet, at his core, he remained a Wallachian Orthodox Christian, deeply marked by the memory of captivity and humiliation. His first reign, however, was fleeting. Within months, Hungarian-backed forces drove him from the throne, forcing him once again into exile. The experience was bitter, but it armed him with lessons he would never forget. Lessons about betrayal, survival, and the brutal struggle for independence caught between two clashing empires. The boyars who had first welcomed him as their rightful prince quickly abandoned him once it became clear that his Ottoman support was too weak to secure victory against Hungarian military strength. The years of exile that followed became a crucial education in politics and war for Vlad. He found shelter in Moldavia under the rule of his uncle Bogdan II, where he observed another strategy for survival in a region surrounded by hostile powers. The Moldavian court showed him a different balance between resistance and compromise, one that shaped his understanding of Eastern Europe's fragile states. During this time, Vlad also forged contacts with Hungarian officials who began to view him as a useful ally against Ottoman expansion. In the tangled world of medieval diplomacy, enemies could quickly turn into partners, and Hungarian leaders saw value in a Wallachian prince who understood Ottoman tactics from the inside. They began cultivating ties with him for the conflicts to come. In 1451, the assassination of his uncle Bogdan II forced Vlad to flee Moldavia and wander once more. He passed through the courts of Transylvania and Hungary, where he studied new political systems and military practices that further sharpened his skills. He observed the Hungarian feudal order, the merchant republics of Transylvanian towns, and the disciplined military orders that guarded Christendom's frontiers. Among the most influential figures in his exile was John Hunyadi, the celebrated Hungarian general and regent. Though Hunyadi had been complicit in the death of Vlad's father, he came to recognize the young exile as a potential asset against the Turks. Their relationship was tense, filled with suspicion and conflicting goals, yet it provided Vlad access to Hungarian support and military knowledge that would later be crucial for his return to power. His education in exile was harsh but invaluable. He learned that survival demanded vigilance, ruthless decisiveness when needed, and the ability to adapt instantly to shifting circumstances. Trust was dangerous, and loyalty was a currency that could be traded or broken at will. These lessons hardened him for the role he would soon claim. The death of his brother Mircea, who briefly ruled Wallachia with Hungarian backing, opened the path once more for Vlad. Mircea's reign had been short and chaotic, ending like so many others in blood and turmoil. His death left a power vacuum filled with competing claimants. Vlad's hereditary right, his training in Ottoman methods, and his Hungarian alliances made him a formidable candidate for the throne. In 1456, he launched the campaign that restored him to power. This time he relied not only on foreign aid, but also on Wallachian boyars weary of endless war and instability. His promise to restore order and defend independence appealed to those tired of serving as pawns for Hungary or the Ottomans. The victory that secured his rule was born of military skill, political cunning, and relentless determination. No longer the helpless hostage of his youth, Vlad had remade himself into a ruler capable of defying both empires. When he entered Targoviste once more, it was not as an Ottoman puppet, but as a sovereign prince, ready to carve his place in history. All that he had endured, his childhood captivity, his Ottoman training, his failed first reign, and his years of exile, had forged him into a hardened leader, uniquely suited for the trials ahead. The castle of his youth now became the heart of his rule, a court from which he would transform Wallachia into a fortress of resistance. The knowledge of Turkish strategy he had once learned as a prisoner would soon be turned against the empire with devastating effect. The harsh lessons of fear, betrayal, and ruthless control would become the cornerstones of his reign and his legend. On a mist-draped morning in 1456, Vlad III began his second reign in earnest. From his residence in Targoviste, he gazed upon the fertile plains that had made Wallachia such a coveted land, and sensed the dangers circling his realm like wolves around wounded prey. What he inherited was a broken principality, weakened by decades of civil war and foreign interference. Constant changes of ruler had crippled trade, emptied the treasury, and drained the people of hope. The boyar class, meant to uphold order, had splintered into factions that cared more for their own fortunes than for the stability of the state. Some nobles commanded private armies larger than the prince's own. Others controlled fortified estates that could easily serve as strongholds of rebellion. Many had built profitable ties with foreign powers, making them dangerously independent of their sovereign. Confronting these realities, Vlad made a choice that defined his rule. He would not attempt to charm or persuade those who threatened his power. He would show them, through methods as merciless as they were unforgettable, that betrayal carried a price in blood. Terror, not affection, would be the foundation of his authority. The prince, who had absorbed the lessons of power during his years at the Ottoman court, understood that fear could serve as a far more reliable foundation for rule than love or respect. His first dramatic demonstration of this philosophy came during what seemed to be a routine Easter celebration in 1457. Vlad invited the leading boyars of Wallachia to attend a grand feast at his court, ostensibly to honor the holy day and discuss matters of mutual interest. The nobles arrived expecting a traditional medieval gathering filled with ceremony, negotiation, and social exchange. Instead, they found themselves caught in one of the most infamous episodes of his reign. As the feast reached its height, guards suddenly encircled the assembly and seized those whom Vlad had secretly marked as disloyal or dangerous. Some were executed on the spot, their bodies left as a warning. Others were condemned to forced labor, their hands turned from holding swords to dragging stone for new fortifications that would strengthen royal power. The survivors left the hall in terror, their loyalty secured not by persuasion, but by the unforgettable threat of death. This ruthless act achieved far more than the removal of rivals. It proved that the young prince possessed both the will and the power to bend the nobility to his authority. It signaled to every would-be conspirator that defiance would be crushed instantly and without mercy. Most importantly, it announced to his entire realm that Vlad would govern not with compromise but with terror, using violence as the iron framework of his rule. The reconstruction of Poenari Castle soon became the lasting emblem of this transformation. Built largely by the forced labor of those very boyars and their retainers who had defied him, the fortress rose high on a mountain overlooking the Argesh River. Perched on its lofty peak, it was nearly impregnable, a stronghold to which the prince could retreat whenever foreign or domestic enemies threatened his rule. Yet its greatest power was symbolic, that men who once considered themselves his equals had been driven to build it with their own blood and sweat, made the fortress not just a bastion of defense, but a living monument to the supremacy of royal power. The reforms Vlad enacted in the early years of his rule drew on the harsh political education he had received as both hostage and exile. He centralized authority within the princely court, cutting away much of the independence that the boyars had enjoyed under weaker rulers. He imposed standardized legal codes across Wallachia, ensuring that justice, however severe, was consistent and unmistakably royal in origin. He introduced tighter systems of taxation and stricter management of state resources, building a financial structure that allowed him to fund his ambitious military campaigns. His military reforms were even more decisive. Wallachia had long suffered from unreliable forces whose loyalty shifted with individual commanders and noble families. Vlad broke this cycle by creating a standing army directly loyal to the throne. Drawing inspiration from the Ottoman janissaries, he recruited and trained soldiers according to his own strict standards. They were equipped with modern weapons and organized by tactical principles he had absorbed during his years of observation in foreign courts. This professional force gave him the strength to impose his will internally and to resist the might of external enemies. His economic measures aimed at both consolidating royal authority and ensuring survival in a land threatened by constant war. He promoted trade with neighboring regions, particularly the wealthy Saxon towns of Transylvania, exchanging Wallachian grain, livestock, and raw materials for manufactured goods. He encouraged local industries that could reduce dependence on foreign merchants and strengthen the principality's self-sufficiency. Yet the ever-present specter of invasion and raids often undermined these efforts. Merchants hesitated to risk capital in a land where battlefields could appear overnight. Farmers limited expansion, fearing their crops might be destroyed by the next march of armies. Thus, the very policies that secured the country militarily often left its economic potential strangled. Religion, too, served as an essential pillar of Vlad's rule. A devout supporter of Orthodox Christianity, he funded the building and restoration of monasteries and churches across his realm. He recognized that the church provided more than spiritual solace. Priests preserved literacy, maintained law and tradition, and helped bind communities together. They offered moral legitimacy to his rule and created cultural ties with other Orthodox states that might serve as allies against the Muslim advance. Yet his brutal enforcement of order sometimes unsettled the clergy. They praised him as a defender of the faith against Islam, but they could not overlook the shocking cruelty with which he exercised authority. His reign reflected the grim paradox of frontier Christendom, where rulers were forced to balance sacred ideals with the unforgiving necessities of survival. The cultural atmosphere of Vlad's court mirrored his own diverse upbringing. Though deeply rooted in Romanian and Orthodox tradition, his household drew advisors and officials with knowledge of Hungarian, German, and Turkish customs. This mix of influences enriched his administration, broadened his diplomatic reach, and kept him informed of the strategies of his enemies. The education of young nobles in his service was shaped by this same pragmatism. Instead of focusing solely on classical scholarship, they were trained in the skills demanded by governance and war. Administrators studied law and mathematics to better manage taxes and resources. Military officers learned engineering and logistics, preparing them to build fortresses and direct armies. Diplomats were taught languages and foreign customs, arming them for negotiations in distant courts. Through terror, reform, faith, and strategy, Vlad began transforming Wallachia into a state whose strength reflected his own hardened spirit. His reputation grew not only as a ruler willing to kill without hesitation, but as one capable of forging order out of chaos. The boyars, who once plotted freely, now lived under the shadow of his wrath. The people, though often crushed by the weight of war, began to see in him a figure who could shield them from foreign domination. And beyond his borders, both allies and enemies learned that Vlad III was no ordinary prince, but a leader whose will was as unyielding as the stone walls of Poenari. This emphasis on practical education revealed Vlad's conviction that good governance required capable execution rather than abstract theory. Among the most striking features of his rule was the judicial system he personally shaped, a system that earned him both respect and fear in equal measure. Vlad himself often presided over trials, delivering judgments that reflected his ruthless dedication to order. His aim was not to build a complicated legal code like those in Western Europe, but to create a justice so certain and severe that no one could doubt the consequences of wrongdoing. The most infamous element of this justice was his reliance on impalement as a punishment for grave crimes. This horrific method was not chosen for spectacle alone. Its slow and agonizing nature ensured that the fate of offenders became an unforgettable warning to all who might contemplate defiance. The sight of bodies writhing upon wooden stakes, visible to entire communities, left no room for misunderstanding. In Vlad's Wallachia, law was not a matter of debate. It was life or death. Foreign visitors noted with astonishment the results of such severity. Merchants could travel unmolested along Wallachia's roads. Theft was rare, and peasants could leave goods unattended without fear of robbery. In a Europe where violence and banditry were part of daily life, this level of order seemed extraordinary. But the price was steep. Peace enforced not by trust, but by terror. Stability purchased with the blood of those who broke the prince's decrees. The domestic strength Vlad had forged gave him the foundation to look outward. A disciplined army, reliable finances, and a centralized administration provided him the tools to confront forces that had long dominated Wallachia. By the late 1450s, the land once fractured by feuding nobles had become a principality, strong enough to defy even its most formidable neighbors. The former hostage, who once bowed to Ottoman masters, was preparing to challenge them directly. As the decade closed, Vlad III stood transformed. He had reshaped Wallachia into a realm with a hardened military, a reorganized state, and a ruler unafraid of using terror as a weapon of policy. The same calculated ruthlessness that had crushed rebellion at home was now poised to be wielded against the advancing armies of Islam. The boy who had learned the methods of the Ottomans in captivity was now preparing to use that very knowledge to resist them. His transformation from captive child to sovereign ruler was complete, yet his greatest trials still waited beyond the mists of the Carpathian. In the autumn of 1459, troubling news reached Târgovişte. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, sent envoys demanding not only tribute, the traditional sign of Ottoman supremacy, but also Vlad's personal attendance at the Sultan's court. The meaning was unmistakable: submit entirely or be destroyed. The ambassadors who carried this ultimatum were seasoned men, accustomed to dealing with cowed rulers across Europe. They expected the usual cycle of resistance followed by reluctant obedience. But Vlad was no ordinary vassal. Years of captivity had given him insight into Ottoman psychology, and loyalty to his homeland gave him the steel to resist. When the envoys arrived, Vlad granted them a private audience. They may have believed the intimate setting signaled readiness to negotiate. What followed, however, became one of the most infamous acts of his reign. Vlad remarked that he admired their devotion to custom, particularly their refusal to remove their turbans before him. Then, with chilling calm, He ordered his guards to nail the turbans to their heads, declaring that this way they would never again be tempted to dishonor their traditions. This gruesome act was no mere outburst. It was a deliberate message. Wallachia would not kneel. The boy, who had once been forced to bow to Ottoman traditions, now demanded that Ottomans bow to his authority within his land. News of the outrage reached Sultan Mehmed swiftly. The insult was personal, a direct challenge to his power. The ruler who had broken Byzantium could not allow a small principality to humiliate his empire with impunity. Preparations began at once for an invasion that would either crush Vlad or replace him with a compliant puppet. Through the harsh winter of 1459 into 1460, both sides prepared feverishly. Vlad fortified his lands with the knowledge he had once gained as a hostage. Lessons in Ottoman strategy now turned against his former captors. He ordered villages cleared to deny supplies to the enemy, bridges destroyed to slow their advance, and forests prepared for ambushes. Wallachia, shaped by his iron will, was ready for the storm that would soon descend. The mountainous terrain of Wallachia offered countless opportunities for ambushes and sudden strikes on advancing enemies. Vlad ordered new fortifications at key river crossings and mountain passes, creating a chain of strongholds that funneled invading armies into carefully chosen killing zones. Local villagers were trained to deny food and shelter to the Ottomans, while providing intelligence about troop movements to Wallachian commanders. The defensive strategy Vlad prepared reflected both his deep knowledge of Ottoman methods and his mastery of the land he ruled. Instead of confronting the massive Turkish army directly in open battle, he designed a campaign of attrition, constant harassment that would weaken the enemy without exposing his smaller forces to destruction. By the spring of 1460, the expected Ottoman invasion had arrived, led by seasoned generals of the empire. Their force was immense, consisting not only of Ottoman regulars but also auxiliaries sent by tributary rulers eager to show loyalty to the Sultan. Together, they embodied the same overwhelming strength that had crushed resistance across the Balkans and broken powers once thought unconquerable. At first, the campaign followed familiar Ottoman patterns. The army advanced along established routes, scouts fanning out to locate targets, and commanders preparing for sieges and decisive encounters. They expected fortified towns, field armies, and terrified peasants. Instead, they encountered a land stripped bare and defenders who seemed to vanish and reappear at will. Wallachian soldiers struck quickly and retreated into forests and mountains, harassing supply trains and ambushing isolated detachments before disappearing again. Water sources were poisoned, food stores destroyed, livestock hidden or slaughtered, and villages emptied. What Vlad created was a wasteland where the Turks could find neither sustenance nor safety. Their long supply lines, constantly attacked, became lifelines stretched too thin. Local guides deliberately misled them, steering troops into traps. This scorched earth policy was as devastating psychologically as it was materially. Soldiers who had stormed Constantinople now struggled against an unseen foe in a land that seemed determined to kill them at every turn. The prince himself became a living symbol of resistance. Vlad rode with his men, appearing at the most dangerous fronts, directing surprise attacks, and fighting with the ferocity of someone who knew every inch of the terrain. His presence inspired his troops and terrified the enemy. He anticipated Ottoman maneuvers with uncanny accuracy, exploiting their arrogance and weaknesses born of overconfidence. The most legendary moment came during his daring night raid on the Ottoman main camp. Penetrating enemy lines under darkness, Vlad's forces spread chaos within what had been thought an impregnable position. The raid was not only a tactical strike, but a calculated blow to morale. It showed that no place, not even the heart of their camp, was beyond Wallachian reach. The campaign reached its climax not in one grand battle, but in the slow unraveling of Ottoman strength. Casualties mounted, supplies ran dangerously low, and hunger and disease weakened the once mighty force. Winter loomed, threatening to trap the Sultan's army in a hostile wilderness with no hope of survival. Reluctantly, the Ottoman commanders ordered retreat. What marched out of Wallachia was not the same confident army that had entered, but a battered, demoralized host, abandoning weapons and provisions that would later strengthen Vlad's defenses. The aura of Ottoman invincibility had been pierced by a principality many had already dismissed as doomed. Across Europe, news of the victory spread swiftly through diplomatic channels. The Christian world, long resigned to the steady march of Turkish conquest, now saw hope in Wallachia's unlikely defiance. Vlad, once derided as little more than an Ottoman pawn, was suddenly hailed as a defender of Christendom. His reputation as a commander who could succeed where others had failed cemented his place among Europe's most formidable rulers. But triumph came at a terrible cost. The same scorched earth tactics that starved the enemy had devastated Wallachia itself. Farms lay in ashes, trade had collapsed, villages stood abandoned, and famine haunted survivors. The independence Vlad had preserved was dearly bought with his people's suffering. Still, the victory of 1460 proved to friend and foe alike that Wallachia was no longer a helpless borderland. It was a land whose prince had shown the will and ability to challenge an empire. The recognition that followed brought offers of alliance from European powers eager to support a man who had bled the Ottomans and survived. Diplomatic exchanges surged across Europe as kingdoms and principalities weighed the possibilities of coordinating action against Turkish expansion. The prince who had once fought for recognition now found himself courted by some of the most powerful rulers on the continent. Pope Pius II, who had been rallying Christian resistance to Ottoman aggression, wrote directly to Vlad, praising his victory and urging him to continue his struggle. This papal acknowledgement gave his cause much-needed legitimacy, elevating him from a rebellious vassal to a recognized defender of the faith. The religious element proved crucial in securing European support for Wallachian resistance. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, though entangled in a complicated relationship with Vlad, could not deny the strategic advantage of having a formidable anti-Ottoman commander guarding the Danubian frontier. Hungarian policy grew more favorable, though always tempered by unease over Vlad's independence and unpredictability. This delicate balance between alliance and control would define Hungarian-Wallachian relations for the rest of Vlad's reign. The triumph of 1460 also reshaped the internal order of Wallachia, reinforcing the prince's authority among his subjects, who had witnessed his ability to shield them from the empire's greatest threat. The boyars who survived his purges found their positions more secure, while those who had aligned with Turkish influence were eliminated or driven into exile. The success of Vlad's policies justified his harsh methods and consolidated his command over the kingdom's political and military elite. By the dawn of 1461, Vlad III Dracula stood at the height of his power. Once a hostage in Ottoman hands, he had transformed himself into one of Europe's most formidable military leaders. From a divided and vulnerable principality, he had forged a nation capable of inflicting severe damage on the greatest empire of its age. The stage was set for confrontations even greater than before, ones that would test both his strategy and the calculated ruthlessness that had become his signature. The forests of Wallachia seemed darker and more foreboding in the early winter months of 1462, as if nature itself anticipated the coming storm. From his mountain fortress at Poenari, Vlad spent long nights preparing operations that would either secure Wallachia as a permanent obstacle to Ottoman advance, or bring about his ruin and the enslavement of his people. The victory of 1460 had brought only a brief respite. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople and master of southeastern Europe, could not allow rebellion to go unanswered. Vlad's defiance was an insult to his authority that demanded retribution, a warning to all subjects that defiance of the Sultan's will was futile. No matter the cost, the preparations for the 1462 campaign dwarfed all earlier Ottoman efforts in the region. Mehmed himself took command of an army greater than any previously sent against Wallachia. It included elite Turkish soldiers, auxiliary contingents from vassal states, and specialist units trained in siege and mountain warfare. The logistical coordination required to support such a force displayed the empire's administrative strength and its determination to annihilate the Wallachian threat. Vlad's intelligence network, carefully cultivated throughout his reign, relayed detailed accounts of the Ottoman buildup. Reports from Târgoviște described a mobilization on a scale that could have conquered entire kingdoms. The Sultan's decision to devote such vast resources to the subjugation of one small principality revealed both the strategic weight of Wallachia and the personal vendetta Mehmed held against his former captive. Vlad's response to this intelligence reflected the same strategic brilliance that had enabled his survival in one of Europe's most dangerous political landscapes. He did not attempt to rally foreign aid in hopes of matching Ottoman numbers. Instead, he planned to turn the very size of Mehmed's army into its weakness. A force large enough to guarantee conventional victory would also be vulnerable to unconventional tactics, the same methods that had bled the invaders 2 years earlier. The scorched earth preparations were even more thorough than before. Everything of value to the Ottomans was destroyed or removed. Wells were fouled with rotting corpses, crops set aflame, and livestock driven deep into mountain shelters beyond Turkish reach. Even the roadside forests were cut down to deny fuel and concealment to the advancing host. The evacuation of civilians from threatened regions was executed with ruthless precision. Entire villages were relocated into fortresses and hidden valleys where they could endure until the conflict subsided. These evacuations demanded strict organization and discipline, for any delay risked capture and exploitation by the enemy. Yet their success would prove vital to Wallachia's survival in the months to come. By the spring of 1462, the confrontation had begun, what would later be remembered as the Night Attack Campaign, one of the most extraordinary episodes of medieval warfare. Mehmed's massive army crossed into Wallachian lands with the confidence of a host that had never known defeat, expecting to find the same familiar patterns of resistance, a field army to crush or fortresses to besiege. Instead, they marched into a land stripped bare, a wilderness of poisoned wells, blackened fields, and deserted villages. The first shock came when Ottoman scouts reported the absence of both defenders and resources in the regions already occupied. Where tributary territories usually offered a blend of resistance and submission, here they found nothing but emptiness and ruin. The campaign they expected would follow the familiar logic of conquest. What they encountered was something entirely different, a war designed to unmake them from within. The countryside seemed deserted of both soldiers and civilians, its silence carrying an unnatural weight that unsettled even veteran troops, hardened by the violence of medieval war. Vlad's design during this phase of the campaign was to remain unseen, striking only at vulnerable points and vanishing before the Ottomans could respond. Wallachian fighters emerged from forests and caves to ambush patrols and convoys, then melted away into the shadows of the mountains before reinforcements could arrive. These assaults were not intended merely to take lives, but to instill in the invaders an unrelenting sense of vulnerability, a fear that no place and no moment was safe. That dread was magnified by Vlad's most infamous weapon of terror, the mass impalement of captured Ottoman soldiers along the routes used by the advancing army. These grotesque displays served several tactical purposes beyond their horrifying spectacle. They delayed progress, forcing commanders to divert men for burials and clearings. They reinforced the futility of defiance against Wallachian authority. Most of all, they branded Vlad as an enemy of merciless resolve, one who would grant no quarter to those who threatened his land. The ghastly sight of entire roads lined with the impaled became one of the enduring images of medieval warfare, searing itself into legend far beyond the actual events. Chroniclers recorded the horror and despair these scenes provoked among Ottoman troops, many of whom had never faced such deliberate and theatrical cruelty. Vlad's orchestration of psychological warfare would influence military thought for centuries after. Sultan Mehmed's personal reaction revealed how deeply the struggle had shifted from strategy to pride. The conqueror of Constantinople, master of an empire that spanned continents, now found himself defied by a minor frontier prince whose realm was scarcely the size of a single Ottoman province. The insult to his authority and the blow to his prestige demanded an answer. No matter the drain on resources or lives, the climax came on the night of June 17th, 1462, when Vlad launched his legendary assault on the Ottoman camp, driving his strike force deep into enemy lines until they nearly reached the Sultan's own tent. This extraordinary feat of boldness was possible only because Vlad knew Ottoman military practice intimately, knowledge he had gained during his years as a hostage at the Turkish court. He understood precisely how their camps were ordered, where guards were stationed, and which paths offered the surest entry. The attack itself displayed the discipline and training he had instilled in his men, moving like shadows through the defenses. Wallachian troops silently cut down sentries, spread chaos through the encampment, and struck terror into soldiers who had thought themselves secure behind fortified lines. The aim was not annihilation of the Ottoman army, which sheer numbers rendered impossible, but to prove that no position, not even the Sultan's, was beyond the reach of Wallachian vengeance. The psychological effect was immense. Mehmed, who styled himself heir to Caesar and Alexander, had been humiliated by a one-time hostage ruling a land with but a fraction of Ottoman strength. The blow to Turkish prestige echoed through Europe, emboldening those who had resigned themselves to Ottoman inevitability. In the weeks that followed, the campaign unraveled. After months of fruitless marching, supply shortages, and now the shock of the night attack, the Ottoman army grew weary and disordered. Disease spread through malnourished and exhausted ranks. Desertion increased as soldiers lost faith in a campaign that brought only suffering and disgrace. By late 1462, Mehmed resolved to withdraw. For the empire that had stormed Constantinople and dominated southeastern Europe, the retreat was among its gravest defeats. The vast Ottoman host had been driven back by a principality whose population barely equaled a single Ottoman city. Strategically, the failure shaped policy for decades, forcing the Turks to reconsider the costs of their Balkan conquest. The victory sealed Vlad's renown across Europe. He was now hailed as Christendom's fiercest warrior against the Ottoman advance. Rulers who had once dismissed him as a petty frontier lord sought his alliance, recognizing in him a bulwark capable of inflicting wounds on the empire none had thought possible. Yet this triumph carried bitter costs for his own land. The scorched earth policy that had starved the Turks had also crippled Wallachian farms and markets. Endless war-drained manpower and emptied treasuries, leaving vulnerabilities his enemies would later exploit. His ruthlessness, so effective in war, also fueled a dark reputation his rivals would wield against him. The international recognition that followed the campaign brought both promise and peril. European powers eager to use Wallachia against the Ottomans were not necessarily invested in its independence should circumstances shift. The tangled network of alliances and rivalries that shaped medieval politics meant that today's indispensable partner might be tomorrow's betrayer. For Vlad, the challenge was to steer through these treacherous waters while preserving the freedom he had won at such terrible cost. The years after Mehmed's withdrawal saw growing friction with Hungary, Wallachia's most vital Christian ally, setting the stage for new conflicts that would test whether Vlad's hard-won independence could endure. King Matthias Corvinus, while grateful for Vlad's role in checking Turkish expansion was equally troubled by the growing independence and military strength of his southern neighbor. The Hungarian monarch began seeking ways to bring Wallachia more firmly under Hungarian influence, setting in motion conflicts that would ultimately prove more dangerous to Vlad than the Ottoman invasions he had so often defied. The prince, who had withstood the greatest empire of his age, was about to discover that victories over external enemies could create internal vulnerabilities far harder to resolve. The fearsome reputation that had once protected him would soon be turned against him, wielded by enemies who understood that psychological warfare could be just as effective in destroying rulers as in defending nations. By the opening of 1463, Vlad III Dracula stood at the height of his power and renown. Throughout Europe, he was hailed as the defender who had proved Ottoman expansion was not inevitable. His position seemed secure, built upon triumphs in battle, diplomatic recognition, and the reluctant respect of his people who had witnessed his ability to shield them against overwhelming odds. Yet the very qualities that had elevated him now prepared the ground for his downfall. The medieval world was poised to demonstrate that even the most formidable leaders were at the mercy of shifting politics and the fickle loyalties of allies and rivals alike. In the autumn of 1462, the walls of Târgoviște closed in upon him. Despite remarkable victories against the Ottomans, Vlad faced an insidious threat, the steady erosion of support among those allies who had once benefited most from his campaigns. The Hungarian court, whose assistance had proved essential during his anti-Ottoman struggles, began to see Wallachian independence as a danger to its own interests. King Matthias confronted a strategic dilemma that would ultimately sever his alliance with Vlad. He needed a strong prince to guard the Danubian frontier, yet he also required that this ally remain firmly under Hungarian control. Vlad's growing renown and his undeniable military power made him a valuable buffer, but also a potential rival for dominance in southeastern Europe. Letters exchanged between the two courts revealed the strain beneath the surface. Hungarian officials praised his victories, yet quietly criticized his methods, hinting that his merciless tactics might harm the wider Christian cause. Such remarks were calculated to diminish his reputation abroad and prepare the ground for more direct intervention in Wallachian affairs. Vlad's response reflected both his political acumen and his increasing isolation. Rather than offering concessions that might weaken his rule, he chose independence, even if it meant defying former friends. From his time as a hostage in the Ottoman court, he had learned that submission to one power rarely brought safety, it merely exposed weakness to another. The final spark came from disputes over fortresses straddling the Hungarian-Wallachian frontier. These strongholds carried immense strategic weight, but also symbolized the larger question of Hungarian authority over Wallachian lands. When Vlad refused to recognize Hungarian claims to territories he considered his rightful inheritance, the quarrel intensified. During the winter of 1462-1463, urgent messages arrived from Buda demanding that he present himself before King Matthias to resolve their differences. Though couched in the language of friendship and cooperation, the threat was unmistakable: submit or face the wrath of a kingdom far stronger than his own. Confident in his diplomatic skill, Vlad accepted. He had maneuvered between Ottoman and Hungarian courts before and believed he could again safeguard Wallachian independence while preserving cooperation against Turkish advances. This time, however, his judgment proved fatally wrong. The journey to Buda led him through lands scarred by Ottoman devastation, villages in ashes, fields abandoned, a grim reminder of how fragile the small principalities were between great empires. The sight confirmed both the price of victory and the precariousness of his position. At first, his welcome matched his expectations. King Matthias received him with due honor, their meetings conducted under the formalities of equal rulers. They spoke of renewed efforts against the Ottomans and of sharing responsibility for defending Christendom's frontier. But the tone shifted suddenly when Hungarian officials produced supposed evidence of secret correspondence with Sultan Mehmed. These documents, likely forged or distorted, accused Vlad of plotting to betray his Christian allies and return to Ottoman allegiance. The charges, though dubious, gave Matthias the justification he required. Vlad was arrested in 1463, marking the end of his military career and the beginning of an imprisonment that would last over a decade. The prince who had humbled the Ottoman Empire now found himself caged by the very allies who had most profited from his defiance. Contemporaries saw the irony clearly. Christian politics could prove as treacherous as Ottoman intrigue. The accusations were never conclusively proven, and historians largely regard them as pretexts. But for Matthias, the matter was simple. Securing Hungary's hold over Wallachia demanded the removal of a prince whose independence could not be bent to foreign will. The simplest solution for Hungarian authorities was to remove him from power using accusations of treason and betrayal to justify their actions. His imprisonment was conducted with the courtesies due to a prince, yet it represented a profound humiliation for a ruler who had spent his entire life defending his independence. Vlad was provided with comfortable quarters in Hungarian castles, books and amenities befitting his rank, but he was denied freedom. The ability to return to his kingdom or influence events in the region he had defended with such skill. During captivity, he witnessed the slow erosion of the achievements he had fought so hard to secure. Wallachia fell under rulers selected by Hungarian authorities, men more willing to accommodate foreign influence in exchange for royal favor. The administrative and military reforms that had strengthened the principality were gradually dismantled, and the harsh but effective methods Vlad had employed to maintain order were replaced with conventional, less capable approaches. The years of confinement also allowed Vlad time for reflection. The prince, forced to master survival as a child hostage, had applied those lessons to forge one of medieval Europe's most formidable military reputations. His success in resisting Ottoman expansion proved that small states could withstand great powers if willing to pay the price in blood and determination. Yet the very brutality that had made him effective was ultimately unsustainable. It had created enemies among those who should have been allies, and the fearsome reputation that had protected him now made him a liability to Christian rulers reliant on conventional diplomacy. The very traits that enabled his rise had also set the stage for his fall. Even during Vlad's captivity, the broader strategic context remained pressing. Ottoman pressure on southeastern Europe persisted, demanding vigilance and coordination among Christian powers. The absence of a strong Wallachia ruler left the region more vulnerable, vindicating Vlad's insistence on maintaining effective resistance. Reports from Wallachia depicted gradual decline under less capable leaders, while the kingdom that had once resisted Ottoman conquest became increasingly reliant on Hungarian protection, precisely the outcome Matthias had sought by removing Vlad. Diplomatic correspondence circulated across European courts, frequently referencing Vlad's past accomplishments and speculating about his potential return. Some viewed him as a valuable ally against Ottoman expansion, others as a dangerous force whose independence threatened stability. This divided opinion reflected the complicated legacy of a ruler whose methods were effective but whose reputation made him difficult to integrate into conventional diplomacy. Religious authorities were similarly split. Clerics appreciated his role in defending Christendom, yet they recoiled at the extreme violence that had marked his reign. The tension between moral principles and political necessity highlighted the challenges facing Christian rulers trying to balance faith with survival. As years passed, prospects for Vlad's restoration seemed increasingly dim. Hungarian authorities, having achieved their strategic goals, had little reason to risk instability by reinstating him. Wallachian nobles had adjusted to new arrangements, enjoying security and privileges under Hungarian oversight. The international situation had shifted, making Vlad's unique blend of skills and fearsome reputation less immediately relevant. Yet Vlad, hardened by childhood captivity and forged through battlefield triumphs, was unwilling to accept permanent exile. In the later years of imprisonment, he began cultivating relationships with Hungarian nobles who might support his return, while maintaining ties with loyal Wallachian supporters. Shifts in Ottoman policy during the 1470s gradually created conditions favorable to his restoration. Turkish campaigns threatened territories once secure under his rule, and his successors proved incapable of organizing effective resistance, calling into question whether his removal had truly served Hungarian interests. King Matthias, confronted with renewed Ottoman threats and the inadequacy of Vlad's replacements, began reassessing the wisdom of keeping the prince imprisoned. The strategic reasoning that had led to his arrest in 1463 now required re-evaluation, as Vlad's military talents could once again serve Hungarian objectives. Discussions of his potential restoration began circulating in diplomatic channels, contingent on his willingness to acknowledge Hungarian oversight. The eventual negotiations for Vlad's release illustrated the delicate interplay of loyalty and strategic necessity in medieval politics. The prince, who had defied both Ottoman and Hungarian pressure in the past, was now required to demonstrate his commitment to Hungarian interests to regain freedom. The agreement securing his release represented a personal victory, yet it confirmed that his independence would be more constrained than during his earlier reign. By 1474, Vlad III Dracula was preparing to reclaim the kingdom he had lost more than a decade earlier. The world had changed during his captivity, presenting new threats and opportunities that would test his political and military acumen. The prince, once one of Europe's most independent rulers, faced the challenge of determining whether his reputation and skill could be restored along with his throne, or if years in exile had permanently altered the conditions that had enabled his earlier success. The pale winter sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Visegrad Castle as Vlad prepared to step out of more than a decade of Hungarian captivity. The man who emerged from captivity in 1474 bore the marks of years spent confined, yet his bearing retained the unmistakable authority of a born ruler. At 43, he was no longer the young prince who had defied the Ottoman Empire, but the intelligence and strategic acumen that had made him formidable remained as sharp as ever. Hungary, the kingdom that released Vlad, had itself changed, facing pressures that once again made his unique skills and experience valuable. King Matthias Corvinus realized that the compliant rulers he had installed in Wallachia lacked the ability to maintain effective resistance against renewed Ottoman pressure. The very calculations that had justified Vlad's imprisonment were now being reconsidered in light of developments that threatened Hungarian interests across southeastern Europe. The negotiations for his release highlighted how Vlad's reputation had evolved during captivity. European courts that had once seen him as a dangerous maverick now remembered primarily the prince who had successfully resisted Ottoman expansion when others had failed. His controversial brutality was increasingly overshadowed by respect for his achievements against a persistent common enemy. The agreement granting him freedom reflected both his enduring value and the limits placed on his independence. Vlad acknowledged Hungarian suzerainty over Wallachian affairs and accepted Hungarian advisors to oversee his policies. In return, he received military support for his restoration and guarantees of assistance against future Ottoman attacks. The arrangement was a compromise, satisfying neither party completely, but offering advantages neither could achieve alone. The journey from Hungary to Wallachia gave Vlad his first view in more than a decade of the changes in his homeland. The countryside bore the scars of repeated campaigns, while towns and villages showed the economic decline caused by political instability. The population that had once prospered under his harsh but effective rule suffered under weaker successors. The 1476 campaign, restoring Vlad II's power was a shadow of the military operations that had marked his earlier career. The prince, who had commanded the loyalty of thousands of Wallachian soldiers, now relied heavily on Hungarian support and a relatively small number of local followers. The kingdom he sought to reclaim had been weakened by years of mismanagement and foreign interference. Yet, the initial phase of restoration progressed more smoothly than expected, as the incumbent ruler fled rather than confront the returning prince, whose reputation still carried weight among the populace. News of Vlad's return spread rapidly, stirring excitement among those who remembered the security and prosperity of his previous reign. But this enthusiasm was tempered by doubts over whether he could recreate the conditions of his earlier success. The Wallachia Vlad inherited for the third time was a diminished shadow of his former kingdom. Administrative systems he had built were neglected or dismantled. The military forces that had made him formidable were dispersed or absorbed into Hungarian units, and the treasury lay nearly empty. The nobility was divided, and the population demoralized by years of uncertainty and decline. Vlad's response demonstrated both his persistence and his recognition that changed circumstances required modified strategies. Instead of immediately reinstating the harsh methods that had once been effective, he implemented moderate policies to rebuild popular support and reaffirm his commitment to Wallachian independence. Administrative reforms reflected lessons from captivity and observation of Hungarian governance. He introduced systematic procedures for tax collection and legal administration while strengthening royal authority. Improved communications between the capital and provinces ensured consistent implementation of policy. Military reorganization was crucial, as maintaining power required restoring the formidable forces that had made Wallachia a regional power. Available resources were far more limited than in his earlier reign, forcing him to rely heavily on Hungarian support while gradually rebuilding native capabilities to restore full military independence. Economic policies sought to revive the prosperity that had underpinned his previous success. Vlad encouraged trade with neighboring territories, particularly the Saxon cities of Transylvania, and attempted to restore agricultural production disrupted by years of conflict and neglect. These reconstruction efforts, however, were challenged by persistent international pressures. Ottoman forces remained active, conducting raids and reconnaissance that kept the principality under constant threat. Turkish commanders, remembering Vlad's earlier victories, were determined to prevent him from re-establishing himself as a formidable opponent. The greatest challenge came in late 1476, when Ottoman forces launched a major raid into Wallachian territory, testing the prince's ability to defend his kingdom. The assault targeted weaknesses developed during his absence and sought to exploit areas where Hungarian support might prove insufficient. The confrontation would determine whether Vlad could rebuild the military reputation that had once made him one of Europe's most formidable rulers. The Battle of Bucharest in December 1476 became the ultimate test of Vlad's skill and adaptability. The Ottoman force was substantial, though not overwhelming. The Ottoman incursion was designed to test Wallachian defenses rather than achieve full-scale conquest. Turkish commanders anticipated encountering the weak resistance that had characterized Wallachian forces during the interregnum, expecting to assert Ottoman superiority while gathering intelligence on the restored prince's capabilities. Instead, they faced a ruler who retained much of his tactical brilliance despite years of enforced inactivity. Vlad deployed his limited forces with strategic precision, maximizing their effectiveness while minimizing exposure to Ottoman numerical advantage. He created conditions that favored defenders despite their smaller numbers and inferior equipment. The battle itself was fierce but brief, as both sides recognized that prolonged combat would favor the larger Ottoman army. Vlad's strategy aimed to inflict enough casualties to discourage future raids while avoiding decisive engagements that might destroy his own forces. This tactical success reaffirmed his enduring military skill, yet it also underscored the constraints under which he now operated. The aftermath highlighted both the potential and the limitations that would define the remainder of Vlad's career. The successful defense bolstered his reputation among his subjects and proved he could still protect the kingdom from external threats. Yet the narrow victory also revealed the precarious nature of his position and the constant dangers inherent in confronting Ottoman forces the winter months following. The Battle of Bucharest was spent strengthening Wallachian defenses and preparing for the renewed Ottoman pressure everyone expected. Vlad labored tirelessly to rebuild the military capabilities that had once made his principality a formidable obstacle to Turkish expansion. These efforts, however, were hindered by limited resources and the ongoing need to navigate Hungarian influence over his policies. The diplomatic landscape during this period was equally complex. European powers closely observed the implications of Vlad's restoration and the outcomes of his confrontation with the Ottomans. Some saw in his success the promise of a renewed ally against Turkish expansion, while others doubted his ability to recreate the conditions that had made his earlier reign effective. The final years of Vlad's life were marked by growing isolation as political circumstances evolved against him. Hungarian protection, which had enabled his return, now imposed limits that curtailed his freedom of action. The Ottoman Empire, though temporarily checked, remained committed to eliminating a ruler whose very existence challenged their authority in the region. By the winter of 1476 into 1477, reports reached Targovish of Ottoman preparations for a larger campaign intended to remove the Wallachian threat once and for all. Intelligence indicated that Sultan Mehmed was personally determined to complete the work interrupted by Vlad's earlier resistance, deploying overwhelming forces against a principality that could no longer rely on surprise. This prospect caused a crisis of confidence among Vlad's supporters, many of whom recalled the heavy toll of his previous victories over Ottoman armies. The boyars who had survived earlier purges hesitated to risk themselves in another potentially catastrophic struggle. The general population feared renewed warfare in a homeland already scarred by conflict. On a cold January morning in 1477, the man known throughout Europe as the Impaler met his end under circumstances that remain mysterious. Whether he fell fighting Ottoman raiders, was betrayed by his own nobles, or succumbed to the accumulated strain of a lifetime spent in relentless conflict, his death marked the conclusion of one of medieval Europe's most extraordinary careers. Vlad III Dracula was interred at Snagov Monastery, an island refuge he had used during turbulent years. His simple grave stood in stark contrast to the elaborate tombs of contemporary rulers, perhaps reflecting the prince's understanding that his legacy would rest on deeds rather than monuments. The monastery itself would become a site of pilgrimage for those remembering his defense of Christian Europe against Islamic expansion. Thus concludes our journey through the shadows of medieval Wallachia and the extraordinary life of Vlad III Dracula, a prince whose name became synonymous with terror, yet whose story illuminates the complex realities of leadership in an age when survival demanded choices that challenged the conscience of any ruler. May his example remind us that history is rarely simple, that hero and villain often inhabit the same soul, and that the price of independence can exceed what any nation should be asked to pay.